The neon lights of Kepler Station's cantina cast strange shadows across the crowded room. Smoke from a dozen different worlds mixed in the air, creating a haze that made everything look dreamlike. In the darkest corner, where the lights barely reached, sat a creature that would give most humans nightmares. Vexera was a Catharian, standing nearly 8 feet tall with 4 powerful arms and natural armor that looked like black metal. Her face was angular and sharp, with mandibles that clicked when she spoke. She had killed more beings than she could count, and her reputation as a mercenary was known across 3 star systems. Across from her sat a figure wrapped in a dark cloak. The hood was pulled so low that Vexathura could not see the client's face, but she could smell fear mixed with desperation. Good. Desperate clients paid better. Triple rate, the hooded figure said again, pushing a datapad across the table. The metal surface was scratched and dented from years of use, covered in stains that could have been anything from spilled drinks to dried blood. 6 humans. Special Forces Unit. They have been causing problems for our mining operations in the Outer Rim. Stera picked up the datapad with one of her lower arms, while her upper hands remained ready to draw weapons. Trust was a luxury she had never been able to afford. Her large eyes scanned the information, and her mandibles clicked with what might have been amusement. The target profile showed 6 unremarkable bipeds with primitive kinetic weapons. Humans were known throughout the galaxy as a young species that had barely learned to travel between stars. Their technology was crude, their bodies were weak, and they died easily. Most aliens considered them little more than clever animals. The team leader was Captain Lee Deho, a human male with graying hair and tired eyes. His file showed numerous commendations, but Vexthera had seen many decorated soldiers die screaming. The rest of the team looked equally unimpressive. Corporal Park Minsu was listed as a demolitions expert, though his equipment looked ancient compared to modern plasma explosives. Sergeant Kim Tae-woo carried what humans called a sniper rifle, a primitive weapon that fired metal projectiles. Private Han Jin-ho was their communications specialist. Working with technology that most civilized species had abandoned centuries ago, Lieutenant Choi Sung-min served as their medic, though human medicine was laughably primitive. The youngest was Private First Class Yoon Cogin, barely more than a child by human standards. Hume Vexthera said, her translator device rendering the word with the same tone she might use for parasites. Soft-skinned primates with crude technology. Why are you offering triple the standard rate for such simple prey? The clients who'd shifted slightly, and Vexera caught a glimpse of scaled skin beneath. They are persistent. Previous attempts to remove them have failed. This gave Vexthera pause. She had worked with many species over the years, and most had predictable weaknesses. Humans were supposed to be among the weakest. They had no natural armor, no claws or fangs, no psychic abilities, were not particularly strong or fast. Their technology was primitive, and their lifespans were short. What could possibly make them difficult to kill? Still, triple rate was triple rate. Within 2 hours, Vexera had assembled her team at a table in the cantina's back room. These were professionals she had worked with before, beings who had survived in the mercenary business through skill and ruthlessness. Gorth was a massive insectoid warrior from the Hive Worlds, standing over 9 feet tall with a carapace that could stop most weapons. His forearms ended in claws that could tear through metal, and his compound eyes could see across multiple light spectrums. He cracked his knuckles with sounds like breaking ceramics, a habit that had intimidated countless enemies. Zine was a shape-shifting morphin, capable of taking any form she had studied. Her natural state was a fluid, silvery mass, but she could become anything from a harmless pet to a deadly predator. She rippled through several forms before settling on a humanoid. Appearance with blue skin and large eyes. Shapeshifters were rare and valuable in the mercenary business. Mira was more machine than organic. After decades of cybernetic enhancement, her left arm had been replaced with a weapon system that could fire multiple types of energy blasts. Right eye was a targeting computer that could track multiple targets simultaneously. Half of her brain had been replaced with quantum processors that could calculate trajectories and probabilities in real time. "Easy money," Gorth rumbled, his voice like grinding stone. His compound eyes reflected the cantina's neon lights in dozens of colors. 6 primitives with crude weapons against 4 professionals with advanced technology. "We will be done before the day is half over." The others nodded in agreement. They had faced human pirates before, and the encounters had been disappointingly brief. Humans relied on numbers and desperation rather than skill or technology. A single professional mercenary could typically handle a dozen humans sold either. Surface of Zarian 7 looked like a wasteland painted in shades of gray and brown. Ancient meteor impacts had left craters scattered across the barren landscape like scars on dead skin. No atmosphere meant no weather, no erosion, just endless silence, broken only by the occasional rumble of distant mining equipment. Vexthera,
Oh,
crouched behind a rocky outcrop, her 4 arms checking weapons and equipment. One final time. Her team had been tracking the human unit for 3 days, following heat signatures and communication intercepts across the desolate moon. The humans had come here investigating reports of enslaved colonists, something about illegal mining operations. Using forced labor, through her scope, she could see the narrow canyon system ahead. The walls rose nearly 100 meters on both sides, creating a perfect natural trap. Anyone caught in the bottom would have nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. It was the kind of terrain that made ambushes easy and escapes impossible. Perfect. "Kill zone," Mira said, her cybernetic eye making tiny mechanical sounds as it zoomed in on the canyon floor. The targeting computer in her head was already calculating firing solutions and escape routes. They'll be trapped like insects in a bottle. Below them, the 6 humans moved in a tight formation. Their leader, Captain Lee Daeho, walked at the front with his weapon ready. He moved with the careful steps of someone who had survived many battles, constantly scanning for threats. Behind him, the others maintained perfect spacing. Close enough to support each other, but far enough apart to avoid being caught in a single explosion. Vexthera had to admit they looked professional, but appearances meant nothing. She had killed professional soldiers from dozens of species. Training could only take you so far when faced with superior firepower and technology. The mercenaries had positioned themselves on the high ground surrounding the canyon. Energy shields hummed softly as they powered up, creating invisible barriers that could stop most weapons. Plasma weapons charged with the distinctive whine of contained energy ready to be unleashed. Everything was perfect. Captain Lee Daeho raised his hand, signaling his team to stop. For a moment, Vexthera wondered if they had detected the ambush. But the humans simply knelt in a defensive circle, checking their equipment and sharing water. They looked tired but alert, like soldiers who had been in the field for days. "Now," Vexthera commanded, her voice carrying clearly through the communication system. The ambush began with devastating precision. Plasma bolts rained down from 3 directions, turning the canyon floor into a hellscape of superheated rock and molten metal. The canyon walls erupted in controlled explosions as Gorth's heavy weapons tore chunks of stone loose. Energy beams crisscrossed the space below, creating a web of death that should have vaporized anything caught inside. But the humans did something that made Vexthera's blood run cold. Instead of panicking, instead of running in terror or freezing in shock, they adapted instantly. It was like watching a machine reconfigure itself in real time. Private Han Jinho dove behind a boulder that had been blasted loose from the canyon wall. His equipment case was already open, and his fingers flew over controls that should have been too primitive to affect alien technology. Within seconds, the mercenaries' communication system filled with static and interference. Sergeant Kim, Taewoo found what looked like an impossible shooting position in a crack between 2 fallen rocks. His primitive slug thrower should not have been able to reach the high ground. But somehow he was sending metal projectiles screaming past the mercenaries' heads with deadly accuracy. Lieutenant Choi. Seungmin dragged Private Yoon Seo-chin to cover. The youngest human had been caught in the first blast, his uniform torn and bloody. But instead of slowing the team down, his injuries seemed to make them more dangerous. The medic worked on his wounds while continuing to coordinate with the others, his voice calm and steady over their radio system. Corporal Parkman Sue began setting charges with movements so fast his hands were almost a blur. The demolitions expert was not trying to escape the canyon. Instead, he was turning the aliens' own strategy against them, placing explosives that would collapse sections of the high ground and trap the mercenaries in their own kill zone. What should have been a 5-minute massacre became an hour-long nightmare. The humans fought with a coordination that seemed almost telepathic, anticipating each other's moves and covering weaknesses that the aliens' battle computers could not predict. When one human was pinned down, another would create a distraction. When their communications were jammed, they switched to hand signals that were somehow more effective than electronic systems. "Their weapons are penetrating our shields," Gorth snarled, green blood seeping from a wound in his carapace. A human projectile had somehow found the exact angle needed to bypass his energy barrier and chip his natural armor. How is that possible? Vexthera had no answer. The humans' crude kinetic weapons should not have been able to breach their energy barriers. But somehow they were finding angles and using tactics that defied conventional warfare. Every time the mercenaries adapted their shield frequencies, the humans would find new ways to attack. As the day wore on, something impossible began to happen. The hunters became the hunted. The humans started using psychological warfare, recording the aliens' own death cries and broadcasting them on loop through hijacked communication channels. They created false heat signatures using burning debris and reflective materials. They used improvised explosives to collapse sections of the canyon, changing the battlefield to their advantage. By nightfall, 2 mercenaries were wounded, and the team was forced to retreat, leaving behind expensive equipment and their confidence. The cantina on Kepler Station had never been this quiet. Usually the place buzzed with conversation, arguments, and the clatter of glasses. Tonight, however, every being in the room was listening to Vexthera tell her story. Her forearms gestured as she described the failed ambush, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen something that changed everything she thought she knew about warfare. When she finished, the silence stretched for nearly a full minute. Then, like water breaking through a dam, stories began to flow. An old draconian mercenary in the corner booth slowly raised his massive head. His scales had once been bright red, but age had dulled them to a rusty brown. Scars covered his arms and face, each one telling a story of battles survived. He had been in the mercenary business for over 60 years, and his reputation was legendary. "I knew a crew that took a contract against humans once," he rumbled, his voice like distant thunder. "This was maybe 15 years ago. The Terran Devils, they called themselves. Stupid name, we thought. Humans always gave themselves dramatic names." He paused to drain his drink, a blue liquid that would have been poison to most species. 6 humans in a crashed shuttle, no supplies, no backup, surrounded by an entire pirate fleet. 43 ships, over 2,000 pirates. Should have been over in minutes. Clean up the wreckage, collect the bounty, move on to the next job. The old draconian's eyes grew distant as he remembered. 3 days later, the pirates were begging for mercy. The humans had turned their crashed ship into a fortress. They used parts from their own life support systems to make traps. They turned their emergency rations into explosives. They were picking off pirates one by one, using weapons they made from scrap metal. His claws scraped against the table as he leaned forward. "But here's the thing that still gives me nightmares. Never surrendered. Never even considered it. When the pirate leader offered to let them go in exchange for their cargo, they laughed. Actually laughed. Then they blew up half his fleet with a bomb made from their own shuttle's reactor." A crystalline trader near the bar shimmered as her form shifted through different colors. Her species was known for their ability to analyze and predict behavior patterns, making them excellent at negotiations and intelligence gathering. When she spoke, her voice had a musical quality that made everyone listen. "The Mercenary Guild has been tracking human encounters for decades," she said, her crystalline body reflecting the cantina's lights and rainbow patterns. "Every species has predictable responses to overwhelming force. Reptilians retreat to defensible positions. Insectoids swarm. en masse. Energy beings disperse to avoid damage. Mammals usually flee or submit when faced with superior numbers. Her form pulsed with what might have been confusion, except humans. They do not follow logical tactical doctrine, improvise, they adapt. They turn desperate situations into advantages. Our computers cannot predict their behavior because they do not behave logically. Sign. The shape-shifting morphin shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Her current form was humanoid, but her unease caused her edges to blur and ripple. "But they are just primitives," she said, her voice carrying a note of desperation. "No advanced technology, no natural armor, no psychic abilities. They should not be able to compete with modern military forces." A scarred Vorthan captain at a nearby table turned to face her. His species was known for their tactical brilliance, and his cybernetic implants marked him as a veteran of the Clone Wars. Half his face was metal, and his artificial eye glowed with a red light. "That is exactly what makes them dangerous," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded fleets. "They do not rely on technology. They rely on each other, and they never, ever give up." The conversations continued as the night wore on. Each story was more unsettling than the last. A hive queen told of human soldiers who fought with broken equipment, using pieces of destroyed vehicles as weapons. A void walker described units that held impossible positions through sheer determination, turning certain defeat into victory through pure stubbornness. A young Catherian mercenary, barely out of training, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "How do you fight something that does not follow the rules?" The old draconian laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You do not. You walk away. You find another job. You forget you ever heard of humans." As the stories continued, patterns began to emerge. Human soldiers who used their own blood to mark targets in the dark. Units that fought harder when their members were wounded, not weaker. Warriors who seemed to grow stronger as their situation became more hopeless. One story stood out above the rest. A plasma wraith beings made of pure energy told of encountering human Marines who were fighting with weapons that should not have worked. Their equipment was damaged, their ammunition was running low, and they were outnumbered 10-1. But they had learned to modify their weapons using knowledge that no formal military would teach. They turned their disadvantages into advantages, their desperation into determination. Vexera listened to each story, her understanding growing with every word. She began to see why the contract had paid triple rate. It was not because humans were strong or fast or technologically advanced. It was because they were unpredictable, in a galaxy where warfare had become a science, where computers could calculate the outcome of battles before they began. Unpredictability was the most dangerous weapon of all. The cantina finally began, too empty as the night cycle progressed. But the conversations would continue for days to come. The abandoned mining facility squatted on the dark side of Zarian 7. It's like a metal cancer against the starlit sky. Vexera studied the complex through her scope, counting entrances and exits, analyzing defensive positions. This time would be different. This time, she had brought enough firepower to level a small city. 43 mercenaries and pirates surrounded the facility, their weapons trained on every possible escape route. Gorth flexed his arms in his new armor, the metal plates gleaming under the harsh lights of their assault vehicles. The wounds from their first encounter had healed, but the memory of human bullets penetrating his carapace still made him angry. 43 of us against 6 wounded humans, he said, his voice carrying satisfaction and anticipation. "Ascends." Now, the other mercenaries nodded in agreement. They had brought plasma cannons, energy shields, cybernetic warriors, and even a few combat drones. The human unit had been tracked to this facility 3 days ago. An orbital scan showed they were trapped inside with no way out. But as the assault teams moved into position, something felt wrong. The facility was too quiet, too dark, no movement. Showed on thermal scanners, no energy signatures registered on their equipment. It was as if the humans had simply vanished. The first assault team entered through the main entrance, their weapons ready and shields up. The corridor ahead was long and straight, with doors leading to various mining operations. Emergency lights cast red shadows on the walls, and the air smelled of metal and old machinery. They had taken perhaps 10 steps when the world exploded around them. Park. Minsu's explosives brought down a section of ceiling with perfect timing, crushing 2 mercenaries and blocking the retreat path. At the same moment, Kim Tae-woo's sniper fire eliminated the point man, his primitive slug thrower somehow finding the exact weak spot in advanced alien armor. The remaining mercenaries tried to advance, but every step forward triggered new traps. Han Jin-ho had spent 3 days studying the facility's power systems, jury-rigging electrical grids that should not have worked but somehow sent deadly current through metal floors and walls. Doors that looked safe became death traps, and corridors that appeared empty became killing fields. What horrified the mercenaries most was not the traps themselves, but the coordination behind them. The humans had turned the entire facility into a single weapon, and they wielded it with surgical precision. Every explosion, every electrical discharge, every sniper shot was timed to work together in ways that made the facility itself seem alive and angry. In the medical bay, Lieutenant Choi Sung-min worked on Yoon Seo-chin's wounds while continuing to coordinate with his team. The young private had been injured in their first encounter and wounded again during the facility's occupation. But instead of slowing the team down, his injury seemed to make them more dangerous. "They are not fighting to win," Mira observed, her cybernetic systems struggling to track the humans' movement patterns. Her targeting computer kept losing lock as the humans moved through the facility with knowledge that came from days of preparation. "They are fighting to ensure we never threaten anyone again." This realization sent a chill through the mercenary ranks. Most species fought for survival, for territory, for resources, but these humans were fighting for something else entirely. They were fighting to eliminate a threat, not just to themselves, but to anyone who might face this enemy in the future. The humans used tactics that violated every rule of warfare. They played dead convincingly, lying motionless until alien medics came to confirm kills. Then they would spring their traps, using weapons taken from fallen enemies or improvised from mining equipment. They turned their own injuries into advantages, because a wounded human became unpredictable, and an unpredictable human was terrifying. Captain Lee Dae-ho moved through the facility like a ghost, appearing where he was least expected and disappearing before return fire could find him. His team followed patterns that seemed random but were actually carefully planned. They used alien weapons in ways that violated every engineering principle, but somehow remained effective. The most disturbing moment came when Gorth cornered what he thought was a wounded human in a storage room. The figure was hunched over, breathing heavily, apparently bleeding from multiple wounds. But when Gorth approached to finish the kill, the human looked up with clear, alert eyes and triggered an explosive device that brought down half the room. The human survived. Gorth did not. As the hours passed, the facility became a charnel house. Bodies of mercenaries and pirates lay scattered through corridors that had become mazes of death. The humans had superior numbers, better weapons, and advanced technology working against them, but they were fighting an enemy that seemed to transcend logic itself. By dawn, only a handful of mercenaries remained alive. They huddled in their assault vehicles, too terrified to continue the attack and too ashamed to retreat. Inside the facility, they could hear the humans moving around, checking on each other, treating wounds, preparing for the next assault. But there would be no next assault. Surviving mercenaries had learned something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Humans did not just fight to survive. They fought to win so completely that their enemies would never threaten anyone again. And sometimes that was exactly what they did. The cantina on Kepler Station felt different now. What had once been a place where mercenaries gathered to boast about their victories had become something else entirely. A memorial to failed contracts. A reminder that even the most skilled killers in the galaxy could meet their match. Vexthera sat alone at her usual booth in the darkest corner, staring at the empty chairs where her team used to sit. The silence was heavier than any conversation she had ever had. Her forearms rested on the table, but they seemed to shake slightly, as if the memories of the past weeks had left permanent damage. Gorth was gone. The massive insectoid warrior, who had bragged about crushing primitives, was now in a medical facility on the other side of the galaxy, his carapace shattered beyond repair. The doctor said he would live, but he would never fight again. More importantly, he did not want to fight again. Something had broken inside him that no amount of cybernetic enhancement could fix. Zine had suffered even worse damage. The shape-shifting morphin could no longer hold a stable form for more than a few minutes. Her natural silvery state would ripple and change constantly, showing faces of terror and confusion. No amount of therapy could heal the psychological trauma she had endured. She had seen something in those humans that her mind could not process, and it had left her permanently damaged. Only Mira remained functional, but even she was different. Her cybernetic enhancements had been upgraded with new combat protocols, but she refused to take contracts that involve ground combat. She had become a pilot, staying safely in orbit while others did the dangerous work. The hooded client approached Vexera's table, his posture radiating anger and frustration. Even through the concealing cloak, she could see the tension in his movements. He had paid triple rate for what should have been a simple elimination job, and he had received nothing but failure and excuses. "You failed," he said, his voice carrying the dangerous quiet of someone trying to control their rage. Again, Vexera did not respond with words. Instead, she slid a datapad across the table with one of her lower arms. The device was new, but the footage it contained was burned into her memory forever. She had watched these recordings dozens of times, trying to understand what had gone wrong, trying to find some explanation for what she had witnessed. The client's hands trembled as he activated the datapad. The first clip showed the initial ambush in the canyon, but from the Mercenaries' perspective, it captured the moment when everything went wrong. When 6 humans with primitive weapons had turned a perfect trap into a nightmare, the footage showed plasma bolts that should have been lethal bouncing off improvised cover, and human soldiers moving with coordination that their computers could not predict. The second clip was from the facility assault. It showed humans using their own bodies as bait, playing dead so convincingly that even experienced killers believed it. It showed them turning injuries into advantages, using their own blood to mark targets in the dark. Most disturbing of all, it showed them caring for each other in ways that made them more dangerous, not less. The final clip was the most damaging to the client's plans. It showed Captain Lee Daho and his team extracting the enslaved colonists they had been sent to rescue. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, despite facing multiple mercenary crews and a pirate fleet, they had completed their mission. More than that, they had destroyed their enemies so completely that none of them would ever threaten innocent people again. The client watched in silence as the footage played. His anger gradually faded, replaced by something that looked like fear. When the recordings ended, he sat quietly for several minutes, staring at the blank screen. Without another word, transferred payment for the mercenaries' medical bills and left the cantina. He never returned, and Vexera never learned who he had been or what organization he represented. But she knew that word would spread through whatever network had hired him that night. Vexera walked to the cantina's message board and posted, "A new rule in multiple languages." The message was simple and direct. No contracts involving human military forces. Ever. The pay is not worth the nightmares. The Galactic Mercenary Guild made it official the following week. After reviewing reports from dozens of failed contracts, they added humans to their avoid-at-all-costs list. The entry was unique in the Guild's history. It did not list humans as dangerous because they were the strongest or most advanced species. Instead, it warned that they were the only ones who seemed to get stronger and more creative the closer they got to losing. Years passed, and the prohibition became legend. When young mercenaries would ask about the human restriction, veterans would tell them stories. Tales of the Terran Devils, units that held impossible positions through sheer will. Stories of warriors who turned their own mortality into a weapon, who fought harder when wounded, who never surrendered even when surrender was the only logical option. The humans never knew about the prohibition. They continued their missions across the galaxy, protecting colonists, fighting pirates, and defending the innocent. They remained completely unaware that their reputation had made them the most feared military force in known space. In the end, the greatest human weapon was not their technology or their tactics. It was their absolute refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat was the only logical option. And that, more than any plasma cannon or energy shield, was what made them truly dangerous. Vexera studied the datapad one more time, memorizing faces and tactical information. Something about the client's nervousness bothered her, but she pushed the feeling aside. Credits were credits. This job would pay enough to keep her team comfortable for months. None of them realized they were about to learn why humans had earned a reputation that would soon spread across the galaxy like wildfire.